I was tightening a highway sign bolt when the pigeons suddenly dropped to the ground, not flying up, not scattering, just collapsing into the ditch like they'd rehearsed it. A heartbeat later, a falcon sliced down the shoulder at windshield height, so fast it looked unreal, tracking the white line like it was a hunting rail. And that's when it hit me. These pigeons weren't panicking. They were following a survival routine, because this falcon didn't hunt the sky. It hunted the highway verge, and one wrong move meant feathers on asphalt, a driver swerving, and a chain reaction nobody would see coming until it was too late. Falcon followed the highway verge the way a disciplined patrol follows a boundary, low enough to read every twitch of grass, high enough to stay in control, and steady enough that everything smaller learned to give it space. The highway ran straight for a long time across the flats outside Arroyo Mesa, 2 lanes of sun-baked asphalt with a gravel shoulder that shimmered in the heat. To drivers, it was just a way through, miles you forgot the moment you arrived somewhere with shade. But to the animals that lived alongside it, the highway was a moving river of noise and wind and scraps, a place that created its own rules. There was always something on the verge. Seed heads bent toward the ditch where runoff pooled after rare storms. Beetles hid under flattened cans. Mice ran along the drainage line at dusk. And where there were mice, there were snakes. Where there were snakes and mice, there were hawks. It was a thin food chain laid right out in the open, stitched along the shoulder in a strip as narrow as a sidewalk. In summer, the verge got busy. That's what Mason Klein liked about it. Mason wasn't the kind of birdwatcher who wore a khaki vest and carried a checklist on a clipboard. He was a roadside contractor for the county, sign repairs, culvert inspections, the kind of job where you spent a lot of time parked on the shoulder with hazard lights on, watching the world because you had to be aware of traffic. He'd started noticing birds the same way you notice weather, first in the background, then in patterns, then in predictions. He could tell when a storm was coming by the way swallows dipped low. He could tell when the fields had been cut because the kestrels appeared on every fence post. He could tell when the vultures were about to gather because one would start circling long before the rest arrived, like friends invited late. And lately, he'd been noticing pigeons. Not the city kind that lived under bridges. These were rock pigeons that had taken to the highway rest stop and the abandoned fruit stand at mile marker 19. Every morning and late afternoon they fed on spilled grain from the little feed store's deliveries, on French fries tossed from car windows, on anything that hit the shoulder and didn't get crushed immediately. They were confident birds, confident enough to walk in the white line like it was a sidewalk, confident enough to flutter up only when a truck was close enough for the wind to slap them. Mason didn't like seeing them near the road, not because he hated pigeons, but because he'd seen too many quick thumps on windshields, too many bursts of feathers that made drivers jerk the wheel. He'd also seen the other side of it. The predators that learned a highway was an easy cafeteria if you were quick and precise. That was why, when he saw the falcon the first time, he felt his shoulders tighten. It was early in the day, the sun not yet hot enough to hurt. Mason had parked his county pickup near a "Bridge Ices Before" road sign that had been clipped and bent. He'd set orange cones, pulled on gloves, and started working the bolts loose with a ratchet. Over the metallic click of his tool, he heard a different sound. Fast air, a tight whisper, like someone snapping a flag. He looked up. A falcon cut across the verge, low, following the shoulder line almost perfectly. Not soaring high like a hawk, not wobbling like a kite. This bird flew like a thrown blade, direct, controlled, purpose-built. It passed just above the grass tops, then rose slightly to clear a road sign, then dropped again, scanning. Mason froze with the ratchet in his hand. He wasn't an expert in raptors, but he'd seen enough to know the shape. Long pointed wings, narrow tail, a head that looked compact and intent. It could have been a peregrine, it could have been a prairie falcon. Either way, it was a serious hunter, and it was using the highway edge like a hunting lane. As the falcon swept past, a flock of pigeons that had been feeding near the rest stop entrance reacted instantly. They didn't explode upward like pigeons usually did in panic. They did something else. They dropped low. The birds folded their wings and sank into the verge grass and ditch line, hugging the ground, skimming under the height where a fast strike would be clean. A few fluttered onto the guardrail and pressed themselves against it. One pigeon actually ran, feet pattering on gravel, toward the shadow under the culvert. It was coordinated enough that Mason felt a prickle of surprise. They knew this hunter, and they had learned the safest response wasn't always, "Go up," it was, "Go low." The falcon didn't strike. It simply continued, following the shoulder, banking at the curve where the drainage changed, then disappearing beyond a low rise like it had a schedule. Mason stood there for a long moment, eyes tracking where it vanished. Then he went back to his bolts, but his mind stayed on that low flight line and on the way the pigeons had dropped like they'd practiced. By the time he finished the sign repair, the pigeons were back out, pecking again, a little closer to the ditch than before. The world reset quickly. Animals couldn't afford long fear. They had to eat. Mason drove to the maintenance yard later and mentioned it to his co-worker, Elena Ruiz, who ran the county's roadside vegetation crew and had the casual competence of someone who could drive a tractor and read a map and tell you the Latin name of a weed without looking smug. "Eleanor," he said, leaning on the tailgate while she sorted weed-eater line, "you seen a falcon along 19 lately? Low on the shoulder?" Eleanor didn't look up. "Yep," she said. 2 days now, maybe 3. Why? "Pigeons dropped into the ditch when it came through," Mason said. "Like they knew it." Eleanor snorted softly. "They learn fast when something keeps trying to eat them," she said. Mason hesitated. "Is that normal? Falcons hunting highway edges?" Eleanor shrugged. "The Verge is a buffet," she said. "Mice, sparrows, lizards, plus pigeons if you've got a rest stop. Raptors use fence lines, power poles, irrigation canals. Highway's just another line, loud but predictable." Mason nodded, but something still bothered him. Predictable was exactly the problem. Predictable meant the falcon would keep coming. Predictable meant the pigeons would keep adjusting. Predictable meant someone, at some point, might misjudge timing and end up as a flash of feathers on a windshield. That afternoon, Mason took his lunch break at the rest stop, not because he liked the place, but because he wanted to watch. He parked in the shade of a cottonwood, ate a sandwich slowly, and kept one eye on the shoulder. The rest stop was typical. 2 bathrooms, a vending machine that rarely worked, a couple of picnic tables, and trash bins that overflowed by Sunday. The pavement around it was a mosaic of oil stains and crushed crackers. The pigeons loved it. They strutted around like they owned the asphalt, neck feathers flashing green and purple when they caught sun. A couple with a toddler sat at a table, feeding the kid chips. The toddler dropped half of them. Pigeons drifted closer in a loose half circle, polite until they weren't. Mason watched the birds' posture more than their movement. He noticed that even while they pecked, their heads kept lifting in quick checks. He noticed that their feeding line kept a subtle angle toward the ditch, like an escape route was part of the plan. Then, at 1:17 p.m., the air changed. Mason didn't hear the falcon at first. He saw the pigeons react, their bodies tensed, heads snapped up. The whole flock shifted 2 feet toward the ditch in a single collective movement, the way a school of fish changes direction. A heartbeat later, the falcon appeared, low and fast, coming down the highway shoulder like it was surfing the boundary between asphalt and grass. It wasn't hunting blindly. It had already chosen this line. It was reading the Verge in real time, scanning for the one pigeon that hesitated, the one that stayed in open space a second too long. The pigeons didn't scatter upward. They dropped low again. It was almost elegant. Wings pulled in, bodies sinking, birds sliding toward cover with quick, shallow flaps. 2 pigeons dove behind the trash bins. 3 ran toward the culvert mouth. A few hugged the ground and zipped into the tall weeds like thrown stones. The falcon banked sharply, trying to match the move, but it couldn't dive cleanly into grass without risking collision. It flicked its tail, adjusted, and made a short, controlled climb, then pulled out of the attempt, continuing down the shoulder. It had missed. Mason exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. The toddler squealed, not in fear, but delight. "Bird!" he shouted. The mother looked around, confused. "What bird?" The falcon was already gone. The father laughed and threw another chip. A pigeon popped back out from behind the bin and grabbed it. Mason's jaw tightened. People fed pigeons because it felt harmless. But harmless things became habits, and habits became patterns, and patterns attracted predators. He stood up and walked over to the family, keeping his tone friendly. "Hey," he said, "just a heads up. There's a falcon hunting this verge. If you feed the pigeons here, they'll cluster, and it pulls predators closer to traffic." The father looked at him like Mason had just suggested the sky might fall. "It's nature," he said, shrugging. Mason kept his voice calm. "Sure," he said, "but nature near a highway is a little different. It's safer if they don't bunch up right here." The mother nodded, uncertain. The father rolled his eyes slightly, but he stopped throwing chips, mostly because he didn't want a conversation. The toddler whined. The mother handed him a toy instead. Mason walked back to his truck, feeling that familiar frustration. You could fix a sign with bolts. You could patch a pothole, but you couldn't patch human habits easily. 2 days later, he got a call from dispatch. "Road hazard, mile 19, the voice said. "Bird strike. Driver reports a bird hit windshield. Feathers everywhere. Vehicle still operable. No injuries." Mason's stomach dipped. He drove out with his hazard lights flashing, scanned the shoulder, and found the evidence. A smear on the asphalt near the white line, a scatter of grey feathers, and a few larger flight feathers caught in the grass. Not a falcon feather. Too soft. Too grey. Pigeon. The driver, a middle-aged woman in a sedan, stood beside her car, shaking her head. "It came out of nowhere," she said. "Just bang." Mason nodded sympathetically, gathering feathers with a shovel so they wouldn't blow back into traffic. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "But it scared me." Mason looked up the shoulder, the long straight view toward the rest stop. He felt the weight of a system at work. Pigeons fed by people, pigeons clustering near food, pigeons learning to drop low, some misjudging and darting across the line, traffic unforgiving, and above it all a falcon using the verge like a hunting lane because the lane kept producing. Later that day, Mason went to see the park and rest area supervisor, a man named Doug, who had the permanent red face of someone who spent too much time in sun and too little time listening. Doug listened to Mason's concerns with polite impatience. "We've got signs," he said. "Do not feed wildlife." Mason leaned forward. "People don't read," he said. "Or they read and ignore. The pigeons are clustering because the trash situation is a mess. Overflow, open lids, crumbs everywhere. It's basically an invitation." Doug sighed. "We clean it," he said, defensive. "Not enough," Mason replied, choosing bluntness because gentleness hadn't moved the needle. "If you want fewer pigeons, you have to remove the food, covered bins, more frequent pickups, maybe even a no eating outside the car advisory during peak pigeon time." Doug stared like Mason had proposed banning oxygen. "You can't tell people that," he said. Mason held the stare. "Then don't be surprised when someone swerves to avoid a flock," he said quietly. Doug didn't promise anything, but he also didn't dismiss Mason completely. He rubbed his chin, thinking in the slow way of people whose priorities were budgets and complaints. "I'll put in a request for more bin service," he said finally. "No guarantees." Mason left feeling like he'd pushed a rock slightly uphill. That evening, Eleanor called him. "You seeing the falcon again?" she asked. "Yeah," Mason said. "It's making passes like clockwork." Eleanor paused. "I talked to a rehab volunteer I know," she said. "She said if it's a peregrine, it might be using the highway like a cliff line. Wind currents from trucks, easy lift, plus prey. They're smart. They learn routines. But so can we." Mason frowned. What do you mean? Make the verge less attractive, Eleanor said. Tall grass trimmed in a way that doesn't create mouse highways. Keep trash sealed. Get people to stop feeding pigeons. Less prey, less patrol, Mason exhaled. So basically, he said, fix the human part. Eleanor laughed softly. Always, she replied. The next week, the county did two small things that made a noticeable difference. First, they replaced the rest stop bins with newer models that had heavier lids and self-closing flaps, and they increased pickup frequencies so trash didn't overflow into a buffet. Second, Eleanor's crew mowed the verge in a pattern designed to reduce cover for rodents right along the shoulder, leaving some taller patches farther from the asphalt so the ecosystem didn't get erased, but breaking up the easy runway that small prey used. None of it was dramatic, it was just maintenance, and it changed behaviour. Within days, the pigeons stopped clustering so tightly at the edge. They still showed up, pigeons always showed up, but they spread out more, foraging farther from the white line. With fewer loose chips and fewer open bags in the trash area, they didn't have a single hotspot to defend. Mason noticed the change because the silence changed too. Less constant cooing around the bins, less frantic fluttering when cars pulled in. Then, one bright morning, the Falcon came through again. Mason saw it while repairing a guardrail reflector. It swept low along the shoulder, wings cutting clean air, following its usual line. A few pigeons in the distance lifted their heads and, almost automatically, dropped low toward the ditch. But the flock wasn't bunched anymore. There wasn't a single cluster to hit. The Falcon made one pass, then rose, circled once above the rest area, and drifted out over the fields where smaller birds moved in more natural patterns. It didn't disappear forever, but it stopped treating the highway verge like a guaranteed meal lane. Mason watched it go and felt a quiet satisfaction that wasn't about winning against a bird. It was about reducing the kind of problem that became an accident only after enough small choices lined up wrong. Later, at the rest stop, he saw a new sign taped to the picnic table edge. Please do not feed the pigeons. It attracts predators and increases road hazards. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't official. It looked like Doug had printed it on a cheap office printer and laminated it himself. But it was there. Mason stood near the bins and watched a family eat. This time, when a kid dropped a chip, the mother picked it up quickly and tossed it into the closed-lid bin. A pigeon approached, saw nothing, and wandered off. On the shoulder, the grass moved in wind. No falcon cut through it. Mason didn't kid himself. The falcon would return sometimes, pigeons would always exist, highways would always be dangerous lines in the landscape, but he'd learned something he kept learning in his job. You didn't have to control wildlife to reduce conflict. You only had to stop feeding predictable mistakes. And when the falcon followed the highway verge again, because it surely would, it would find a place a little less profitable, a little less crowded with easy prey. The pigeons would still drop low because they had learned that lesson the hard way, but maybe fewer would dart into traffic. Maybe fewer drivers would slam brakes. Maybe fewer stories would end in feathers on asphalt. Sometimes that was the best kind of success. Quiet, unglamorous, and built from small fixes that nobody applauded but everyone benefited from.